Oh my goodness, we had just come down this gravel road off the main road that goes through Yellowstone, and there's a huge herd of bison right here. 10, 15, 20, I bet there's 50 or 60 of them. I'm in Yellowstone National Park with my producer Lucy. It's early October and we've come around a bend in the road to an extraordinary sight. Some huge males in here. Look at the size of this guy. I roll the window down to get a good look. Standing, watching his herd down in the Lamar Valley here. You can hear him. A huge herd of wild 2,000-pound beasts just a few feet from my car. This is classic Yellowstone. All around us is a wild, open landscape, tall pine trees and mountains off in the distance. It reminds me of an African savanna with a few creeks and bubbling geysers and steep canyons thrown in. It's the second biggest national park in the lower 48, and it gives me the chills simply knowing this protected land is here. I always feel really happy for the animals in a national park, like winding through this giant protected landscape. There's this road, but either side of this road there's nothing but wilderness for miles and miles and miles, and it just makes me happy for the grizzly bears and the bison and the elk and the wolves that are here. All they know is protection. Yellowstone was the world's first national park, created and protected back in 1872. That means the landscape's pretty much as nature meant it to be. All the big critters are still here. And you can't come to Yellowstone without thinking about one in particular, Yogi the bear. The grizzly bear. I've been studying bears and their ecology for over 30 years, and grizzlies have been researched here more than just about anywhere on Earth. This thriving ancient ecosystem is like a sacred space for them. I noticed it as soon as I arrived in Bozeman, just north of the park. There were bears everywhere. I don't mean the real thing, but there's signs about bears, there's signs about bear spray. At the airport there was a sign saying, no bear spray on board, and no bears either. And just suddenly you really feel like you're in bear country. Bears live all over the park, black bears and grizzlies, and what they're in constant search for is food. Calories that will sustain them through their long winter sleep. And right now, October, the feeding frenzy is in full swing. At the heart of the frenzy for some of the bears is the largest high-elevation lake in North America, and in it, a fish, the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. For thousands of years, a key food source for bears to gorge themselves and fatten up on. That is, until almost overnight, the cutthroat trout population pretty much disappeared. The culprit was a much bigger fish, the lake trout, an invasive species that mysteriously arrived in the lake, gobbled up the cutthroat trout, and threw the whole food chain of the lake into disarray.
And what happens in the lake spills out to the land and all the animals there. So there's all these things that happen that we don't even think about initially.
Right, till we come along and disrupt it.
Yep, and you just have no idea how those disruptions will play out until you start asking questions.
Those disruptions to the ecosystem rippled out fast. Scientists suddenly had a race against time to figure out what was going on and how to get rid of the lake trout. In came the helicopters, fishing nets, stun guns, and contract killers. And a team of people trying to make sure it all worked, without upsetting the Yellowstone food chain even more. It's a story of celebrity bears, battling trout, and an ecological emergency that set the scene for one of the most impressive invasive species cleanups in history. From KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to the wild. I'm just curious why you're here. What are you here to see?
The only thing we haven't seen is bear.
Okay.
So we want to see a bear.
You're on the search.
Yes.
We've seen several bisons and kind of a deer and squirrels.
Any bears?
No.
You want to see a bear?
We're really desperate to see at least one bear in here, but yeah, this is our last day.
I talked to all kinds of people in the park, families and groups of friends, solo travellers. The common theme? They want to see wildlife, especially bears. I can't say I blame them. For me, grizzlies are synonymous with Yellowstone, and every time I'm here my eyes are peeled. It's one of the last places you might actually see one in the lower 48. But grizzly bears can also reveal complex connections that might lurk beneath the surface. One of these connections involves a fish, and I've got just the right person to explain it to me. I've come down to the campground at Mammoth in Yellowstone National Park to meet with Kerry Gunther. And Kerry is the bear management biologist for Yellowstone National Park. Quite possibly the best job in the world, in my opinion. Gonna settle down here on a bench, not far from an elk herd. Wow. Cue the elk bugle, that's perfect. That was a male. It's a male elk with a harem of females around him, about 10 of them bedded down in the grass under the trees. His blood-curdling scream shows the other males who's in charge. Perfect place to chat about Yellowstone and its grizzly bears. Kerry, nice to meet you. I'm Chris.
Kerry Gunther, yeah.
We settle on a bench, just a little ways from the elk. Kerry and I know each other's names through the bear world, but we've never met. Yeah, the bear world's a small one, isn't it?
Yeah.
We begin with the topic that's on every bear's mind this time of year: food. And at one time, especially fish.
You know, when the park was established, there's early reports of bears fishing around Yellowstone Lake, and then when you see the pictures of the early visitors holding up stringers of hundreds of fish, you know, you realize cutthroat trout were super abundant and bears had to be eating tons of them.
A bear cub stays with its mother for about 2 years to give the mothers time to pass on a lot of secrets about how to find food, where the best places are to nap, and how to stay out of trouble. If your home range was anywhere near Yellowstone Lake decades ago, you can bet Mama Bear had a lot of good things to say about the all-you-can-eat fish buffet there.
For the most part, like female cubs, when they grow up, their home range is pretty close to what their mother's was, and they might expand out a little bit. And so with bears, you know, a lot of these foods are taught by their mother. And so bears within the Yellowstone Lake watershed, their mothers teach them to fish for cutthroat trout.
They're called cutthroat because they have this bright red slash under their lower jaw that looks like a cut throat. And bears found plenty of them to eat, right up to the late 80s. Back then, the park's grizzly bear population was less than a third of what it is today, and the bears at the lake could feast like kings and queens. Kerry remembers a time when he'd see bears in the streams, peering into the water, looking for cutthroat trout starting to spawn.
And I watched one young subadult, a 2-year-old male, and he caught 26 cutthroat trout in a half hour that I was watching.
No way. That's unbelievable. Is that normal?
For that time, it was pretty normal, I think. And when I first saw him, you know, his butt was in the air and his head was down in the riverbank. And, you know, he was groping under the undercut bank and grabbing fish. And there's a little shallow riffle there as well. And he was just scooping them out.
That's one of them. And he eating them in that time.
Yeah, and he was high grading them. So he was eating the eggs out and, you know, leaving quite a bit. And then coyotes and ravens and bald eagles and stuff were scavenging the rest, but he was eating the best parts and then going on to the next one.
High grading means there were so many cutthroat around that bears could get choosy and just eat the most nutritious parts, the brains and the eggs. Back then, there were about 300 bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and a good chunk of them, about 50, were cutthroat specialists, spending their time on the tributaries around Yellowstone Lake. It was so easy, it was like a fast food drive-through for bears. And it wasn't just the bears that came to the lake and its rivers for the trout. it was people too. It's funny because I think I only knew, this was decades ago, the words cutthroat trout because of grizzly bears in Yellowstone. They kind of put the cutthroat on the map for me.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I think that's true for a lot of people, although like fishermen know cutthroat trout without bears. But for a lot of people, like myself too, I really didn't know much about cutthroat trout until it was bear food.
This part of the world is a magnet for trout fishermen. Crystal clear creeks and snow-capped mountains offer tourists their own Brad Pitt moment with a fly rod, just like in the classic movie A River Runs Through It. And for a time, the fishing was spectacular.
Because I came up here a lot in the late 80s, early 90s, and one of my favorite things was Pelican Creek.
Tig Brown is a fisherman and Yellowstone regular. I encounter him on a viewpoint in the park.
But if you hike back in Pelican Creek when they opened it, it was clear full of cutthroat. Like you'd catch 20 to 30 cutthroat trout in like an afternoon.
He says it was a dreamland if you liked to catch fish. And the bears around here agreed.
Sign in. It's serious grizzly. You don't go back there without bear spray and being aware. Yeah. Sure enough, I was back there fishing and I came back and I ran into a grizzly and it woofed at me. It was tearing apart a log and then it jumped over the log. And the last thing I remember seeing these giant feet hanging down as it leapt over the log.
Oh yeah.
But
away from you.
Away from me.
Okay. For the most part, the ecosystem was humming along nicely. But the dream was about to be shattered. It all started in 1994 with a fisherman and his guide. They were fishing at Yellowstone Lake when the angler hooked something big. The fishing guide took one look and knew right away something was wrong. The drab brown colouring and creamy spots of the large fish were way different to the iridescent pinks and greens of a Yellowstone cutthroat. They reported it immediately to the Park Service. 6 days later, someone caught another. What that angler had caught 30 years ago was a non-native fish, a lake trout. The invasion was underway. Dr. Todd Cole is head of the Park Service's Native Fish Conservation Program in Yellowstone. You're a fisherman, right?
Yeah. I grew up in Minnesota, so I'm a fisherman.
Is this the dream job?
Yeah, I think it's the best job in fisheries in the country. It's got to be. Yeah, I've always thought that.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm lucky. Yeah, I'm lucky.
The smile on your face just says it all. It's really awesome. There's no one that knows more about the impact of the lake trout in Yellowstone than Todd.
Even when the lake trout were just first found in 1994, our modeling suggests there's probably more than 10,000 of them in the lake at that time. You know, it's a big lake, it's deep. Mm-hmm. It just took that many for them to finally be abundant enough to really become known by the rest of everyone in the park.
And that abundance kept on growing. As the lake trout population grew, they began eating everything they could get their mouths around, darting around looking for things to kill, like a swarming mob of Hannibal Lecters.
I don't want to say they're like wolves on the landscape because wolves are native here and I'll get in trouble for that. But if you think about, they're large predators in the lake and they're out there to kill.
The cutthroat trout didn't know what hit them. The lake trout devoured so many young cutthroat, it had an instant impact. Just 1 year after that first lake trout was caught, the number of cutthroat in one creek dropped from 70,000 to a few hundred, and the ecosystem of Yellowstone Lake lurched in a different direction. In the years to follow, the well-studied Yellowstone grizzly bears, always in the limelight, also gave a clue that something was wrong.
And then by 2010, it was pretty drastic. 70% reduction in fish in the diet of those bears around Yellowstone Lake, and probably 60% reduction in the number of bears even frequenting the spawning streams. I think we went over 10 years before we documented a bear fishing again.
Wow, really? The bears were eating less than a third of the fish they were used to. Some of them stopped eating fish altogether.
And the cutthroat trout were on their knees, essentially. They were at the lowest point, was around that point.
Now, you might think it's no big deal swapping one trout for another. There's plenty of fish for bears to eat. Problem is, lake trout are pretty much impossible for the bears to catch. Lake trout are a deep water species. They cruise down at the bottom of the lake.
So a bear would need a snorkel and fins in order to catch them.
The cutthroat trout, on the other hand, live closer to the surface and swim into the streams around the lake to spawn. They're much easier for bears to scoop out and eat. So when the food source for one of the park's most famous animals is threatened, people pay attention.
Grizzly bears drew a lot of attention to the issue, and that brought in a lot of concern and a lot of funding to help address the whole situation.
And ecologists were noticing other things going on with the knock-on effects in the ecosystem. They realized this invasion of lake trout affected far more than bears.
Yeah, there's a lot of species that feed on cutthroat trout, river otters, mink, and also, bald eagles and all kinds of bird species.
After the cutthroat population crashed, researchers watched the number of osprey nests around the lake plummet from 40 to a handful. All told, 42 species of birds and mammals were eating cutthroat trout. It was clear. Todd and his team knew they had to get rid of the lake trout. The battle was about to begin. But how do you get rid of millions of fish from a giant lake they shouldn't be in? That's coming up after the break. There are some pretty major differences between the native cutthroat and the invasive lake trout that help explain how the alien trout population exploded. I asked Todd. To a lot of people, a trout is a trout. Can you give us some brief, basic sort of differences, between the cutthroat and the lake trout?
Well, lake trout are extremely long-lived. They are, 30, 40, 50 years. They have the greatest longevity of any animal in Yellowstone Park.
Really?
They live longer than any other animal.
How long does the cutthroat live?
12, 13 years.
Oh, wow.
So lake trout are extremely long-lived. They produce a lot of eggs, very fecund. So each female, as it gets older, they can produce thousands and thousands and thousands of eggs, each fish.
Young lake trout are 5 times more likely to survive in Yellowstone Lake than even in their native habitat. Besides living long lives and being very fertile, lake trout are hard to catch by the bears, birds, and any other predators.
So they're protected in Yellowstone Lake. They don't have any enemies. Like birds from the surface can't generally access lake trout down deep. You see what I mean? Same with river otters. The river otters can dive so far, but they can't dive to the depths that lake trout generally live, right? So they've got that going for them.
So at over 400 feet deep, their new home here in Yellowstone Lake quickly became a lake trout Shangri-La. But they are not native to Yellowstone Lake, which begs a huge question. How on earth did they get here? The usual suspect in cases like these is a selfish sport fisherman, illegally smuggling in a new fish species in a cooler. But Todd has a different theory.
To be honest, I think they just swam into the lake.
Fish managers stocked lake trout in Lewis and Shoshone lakes on the Pacific side of the mountains here, way back in 1890. But they didn't put them in Yellowstone Lake, on the Atlantic side, because the cutthroat here are a rare subspecies, something to be protected. Todd's theory is pretty surprising.
And so there's a really unique place just south of Yellowstone Park in the Bridger-Teton Wilderness where a stream on the Continental Divide splits perfectly into 2 streams, one running down each side of the Continental Divide.
The Continental Divide is just that, the line of mountains that divides the North American continent and its rivers. On one side, Pacific Creek flows all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. On the other side, Atlantic Creek drops down through Yellowstone Lake all the way to, you guessed it, the Atlantic.
In the spring, during snowmelt runoff, the pass completely floods from one end to the other. So it's a perfect time for fish coming up one stream to cross the divide and then just swim down the other stream.
That's one of the coolest things I've ever heard. In Todd's theory, the lake trout simply swam over the Continental Divide at a place called Two Ocean Pass, right into Yellowstone Lake. There's even genetic evidence for this theory from radio-tagged lake trout. Day 2, and I've driven 2 hours across the park, and I'm standing on the beautiful shore of Yellowstone Lake in my waders, waiting for my ride. It's icy cold, but the sky is blue and there's hardly a ripple on the water. Hi, are you Lusha?
I'm Lusha.
Nice to meet you, I'm Chris.
Nice to meet you, Chris.
What a welcome! I'm here to meet Dr. Lusha Tronstad. She's approaching in a kayak, towing a second one behind that's for me and my producer Lucy to get to today's destination. This is so awesome, this is so kind of you, thank you. What a day as well. Lusha is the Invertebrate Zoology Program Manager at the University of Wyoming. She's a food chain expert. I want to learn what she discovered over a decade ago that cracked the lake trout problem apart. We hop in the kayak and make our way out to a little island. It's only about 500 feet from the shore, but it's a world away, and the heart of some very interesting trout studies. The island's beautiful. What's it called?
Carrington Island.
It's about 60 yards long and super narrow. It's barely more than a shallow moon-shaped crescent of dark rocks with one scraggly 10-foot pine tree at one end. How does such a tiny little island even have a name? And why this? It's such a curious little study site. Why this little island?
This is a major spawning site for lake trout.
We hop out of the boats and scramble across the rocks to the island.
Awesome.
Todd's here, along with 2 other scientists.
Yeah, you got a good day.
They're taking water samples and using nets to dig
Yeah,
up tiny
that's pretty.
bugs in the sand and water offshore.
Yeah.
How many PhDs can you fit on one small island? This is crazy. Are there 4 of you? All 4 of you?
Haley.
And I'm in progress.
Yeah.
Not bad at all. Suddenly I feel very underqualified. Lusha's been coming out here to Yellowstone Lake for over 21 years, starting with research for her PhD. Back then, she was doing some of the first research into how the invasion of lake trout affected the food web.
We're always trying to figure out a better way to suppress lake trout.
Right.
And so we keep trying different things and learning how the food web is reacting to those management actions.
In the early 2000s, Lusha discovered something monumental about what the lake trout were doing to the food web in Yellowstone Lake.
Yellowstone cutthroat trout were the top predators prior to lake trout. So there's only 3 trophic levels in Yellowstone Lake before lake trout.
The trophic levels, or the levels in a food chain, went like this. Algae at the bottom, and then zooplankton and bugs in the middle, and Yellowstone cutthroat trout at the top. But when lake trout invaded, they changed everything. Now, instead of cutthroat being at the top of the food chain, there was a new boss in town. The lake trout added a whole new layer at the top of the food chain. The cutthroat trout had never had a predator in the lake before.
Now we have 4 trophic levels. This is what I did for my PhD. So we have lake trout, eat the cutthroat trout, and then that causes a decline in the cutthroat trout. And because there's not as many cutthroat trout, we saw more bugs in the water, more zooplankton, probably more benthic invertebrates, the ones in the bottom of the lake, and then we see less algae in the lake.
It was a big deal realizing this. It's not common in ecology to see a whole new trophic level added to a food chain that's only 3 levels deep.
So it was exciting discovery that, wow, lake trout, the effects of lake trout trickle down all the way to the algae at the bottom of the food web in Yellowstone Lake, which, you don't really think about that happening.
Thankfully, these days Lusha's seeing fewer and fewer lake trout because for the last 30 years there's been a massive effort to remove them using something called gill netting. Gill nets are huge panels of thin nylon mesh, 6 to 8 feet tall. They have weights on the bottom and floats on the top, which means you can hang them like a shower curtain on the lake floor. They're called gill nets because they catch the fish that swim into them by their gills.
And it can go for a long ways, and they'll set them sometimes in a serpentine pattern on the bottom. So if a fish comes up to the panel of mesh and turns to avoid it, if they swim along the mesh panel for a distance, there might be a sharp turn, and then that fish will likely get caught in that turn, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Once they're trapped, workers in a boat use hydraulic drums to pull the nets to the surface.
So right when ice comes off in the spring, the nets are full of fish, just full of fish.
I mean, how many in a...
Well, I mean, it can be thousands in a week,
Wow.
For sure. Yeah, they're everywhere, yeah.
The first decade and a half of gill netting felt like an uphill slog.
We kept adding more gill net and more boats and more crews, from the late 90s into the 2000s. Every year we'd put more people, more boats, more resources out there, but the lake trout population was way ahead of us.
It became a bit like a game of fish whack-a-mole.
And we thought we were winning the battle against lake trout because we were catching more and more every year, but we couldn't have been more wrong. The lake trout population was in exponential growth at the time. We just didn't even know it.
The turning point came in 2009 when the Park Service decided to call in the Hickey brothers, contract fishermen from Lake Michigan who were well used to catching lake trout. They quickly got to work in Yellowstone Lake. The gill nets they ended up setting would have stretched more than a fifth of the way around the world, and it worked. By 2017, the gill net crews were pulling nearly 400,000 invasive trout from the lake each year. But the problem was, now the lake trout was such a huge part of the system, the park had to worry about what happens now they're taking the darn things out. Lake trout were eating a lot of cutthroat and shrimps and insects, and that nourishment locked some vital Yellowstone goodness inside the lake trout bodies. Nutrients that were important to the lake and tons of other creatures in it.
It's just like your garden. You can grow out and plant your garden, but if you fertilize it, say put out some alfalfa pellets or something like that, your garden is going to grow more vegetables and you're going to have a larger harvest. And it's the same thing in lakes. If you have more nutrients in the lake, you're going to have more algae and whatnot.
So instead of taking the lake trout out and piling the fish carcasses up on the shore, the gill netters started sticking knives into their air bladders so the fish would sink and chucking them back into the water. It was a gruesome business, but this way the fish bodies and their nutrients stayed in the ecosystem for the critters that by now were used to having them. Doesn't having millions of dead fish in a lake mess things up?
Oh, I don't think it does. I mean, fish do die naturally, but of course there's a lot more because of the gill netting. But yeah, it returns all those nutrients to the lake. I think if we pulled them out of the lake, it would be worse consequences for the ecosystem than if we return them.
But the biggest irony, isn't it, that these enemies, these cousins of the cutthroat trout, the bad news for Yellowstone Lake, the bad news for cutthroat trout, are these lake trout.
Yep.
But ultimately, their carcasses, those fish in death are beneficial to the cutthroat in life.
Yep.
The gill netting was effective, but it was never going to catch all the fish in the lake. So phase 2 of Operation Lake Trout kicked in. Target their eggs. But where do you start in a giant lake that now has millions of lake trout in it and 140 miles of shoreline? Well, computer models show that only about 4% of Yellowstone Lake is good spawning habitat for lake trout, like the shallow waters around Carrington Island we've paddled to. In the fall, lake trout come up to these areas and the females lay their eggs, sometimes 10,000 of them at a time. Then the males cruise by, spraying sperm like crop dusters, fertilizing them. And because each female can have thousands and thousands of eggs in her lifetime, killing the eggs before they become young fish could make a real difference. The fisheries experts huddled around a conference table and started brainstorming how to do it.
It was all out of the box, just,
Yeah.
anything.
No bad ideas kind of frame
right,
of mind.
exactly.
Because things were getting desperate.
What you have to do,
They tried everything.
We've done suction dredging. We've done electrocution of the eggs. We've used high pressure water, like fire pumps, to just blow the eggs out of the rocks and into the open lake. It's a lot of stuff.
Eggs need oxygen to survive. So if you can cut off that oxygen by basically suffocating the egg, you can help stop lake trout in their tracks. You could do that with a giant tarp. Or, remember the 400,000 carcasses of the dead lake trout caught each year? Perfect. They tried using those to cover the eggs on the lake bed. Ingenious, even if it is a bit morbid.
And we learned that, yes, this is a very valid way that we can kill embryos on spawning areas each year.
But the park always ran out of carcasses just when egg-laying season ramped up. So they tried something else. They used pellets made out of wheat and soy. The pellets suffocate the eggs just as well as a dead fish. The park just had to figure out a way to spread them. So just last week, right after the lake trout had laid and fertilized their eggs, the Park Service deployed a helicopter to spread pellets on 14 spawning sites around Yellowstone Lake. Most of the pellets sink to the bottom where the eggs are. A few drift onto the rocks on Carrington Island, where they become a sticky goo. The stickiness holds the pellets in place, so they cover the eggs. When they ran this experiment in 2019 and 2020, it was a huge success.
And as far as we could tell, we eliminated all recruitment by lake trout from that site in those 2 years.
All the eggs were eliminated. How'd that feel?
Yeah, good.
What do you got there, Haley?
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Haley Glassick, one of Todd and Lush's colleagues, picked something up that looks like a pale whitish pea from the water between two rocks.
What is that?
So it's a lake trout egg.
Really?
Yeah.
And we are assuming that it's dead because it's opaque. And
Yeah.
so when they're, alive, they're orange, they're a bit more transparent, maybe look more like an orange circular jelly bean.
Mm-hmm.
But this one, right, is very white. We can't see through it at all. And so it's most likely dead. And it's out of the water now.
And what does that tell you guys?
The treatment was successful.
All right.
We have suffocated the egg.
Everyone's happy to see this tiny lake trout egg. It's proof that their efforts are working. But Lush is not here to count dead lake trout eggs. She's here to keep a close eye on those trophic levels she discovered more than a decade ago. Her team is taking samples to see if the pellets are entering the food chain, which might not be good. The pellets aren't a natural part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, we're looking at all the connections in the food web and how, here's our food web before, and then what happens when we add pellets? How do those connections change and the strength of those connections? Mm-hmm.
They start at the very bottom with algae, and to collect it, they use a specialized tool. It's called a toothbrush. There are lots of ways to make a living, right?
Oh yes, no, I scrub rocks with toothbrushes. I've been doing it for a long time too.
So you're just basically trying to scrub off as much of the algae as possible, and that's the stuff you're going to keep to analyze.
Yes, yep. And it's not just algae, to be honest with you. We call it biofilm because there's algae, photosynthesizing algae plants, and there's fungi and microbes. It's a real mix of critters that live on the rocks. Mm-hmm. And it's a big food source for a lot of invertebrates in the lake.
Algae and microbes are important because everything in the food chain above them depends on this layer and contains it in their cells. So it's a good place to start when you're monitoring to see if the pellets have entered the food web.
And we'll be coming back next spring, right after the ice comes off the lake, and we're going to measure all these things again, the algae, the bugs, and the fish, and we'll see, can we see any evidence of pellets in their tissues?
blushers watching carefully for those trophic levels to rearrange, back to what they were in the past, that 3-layered food chain instead of 4. What would you like to see here in this food chain that you're unraveling, say 50 years from now?
Oh, wow. If we can get back to that original food web configuration that I measured before lake trout introduced, that would be huge. And we may not get all the way there, but if we can get close to it, that would be really exciting.
Almost like you've rebuilt something special.
Yep.
Yellowstone's battle against lake trout gets worldwide attention. Why? Because against all the odds, it's working. The cutthroat trout are coming back. They're coming back because the Park Service has now removed 4.5 million lake trout and counting, as well as billions of their eggs too.
Each one of those lake trout that we've removed, if left alone, just say on average each lake trout would eat 50 cutthroat trout per year or something like that. You can also start to see like how many cutthroat we've saved by removing all those fish every year over time, you know.
Is it safe to say the cutthroat would be gone?
Yeah, pretty ecologically extinct. There might be a few fish out there that persist, but they would have no meaning in the ecology of the ecosystem at all. They would be functionally extinct.
Todd monitors the cutthroat trout by catching and releasing them, and he gets some help from local anglers.
We put these little plastic tags that have a unique number for each fish. Now on the other side of the tag is my phone number.
Oh.
Yeah, and we have over 12,000 of those fish tagged swimming around the ecosystem now.
Do you get a lot of phone calls?
Yeah, and text messages because it says call or text, and then it's got my cell number.
And not only is the cutthroat trout population increasing, the fish themselves are much bigger and healthier than before.
And so from a lot of standpoints, I can imagine from a grizzly bear standpoint, that's not all bad. But certainly from an angler standpoint, it's the fishing is awesome. Yeah, and the fish that people are catching are just trophy size and condition.
Really?
And they're healthy. They're just beautiful, beautiful fish all the way around.
How does that make you feel?
Good. Yeah,
I mean,
it was just a long time coming, but wow.
Does it make you proud and
yeah,
and reflect?
It's been good. I'm starting to.
Todd's clearly in it for the long haul, and it's not over yet. Everybody knows that getting rid of every single lake trout is impossible in a lake this big and deep. And then there's climate change and disease. But for now, fingers crossed, the park seems to be winning. So, back to where the story started, the grizzly bears. With the cutthroat trout coming back, Kerry said the bears are coming back to the lake too. They're seeing grizzlies patrol the streams again, fishing for cutthroat trout in some traditional spots, like they did back in the 80s.
You know, I remember those days in the mid-80s when fishing was a big source of food for the bears with home ranges in the Yellowstone Lake watershed. And then we had more than a decade where we almost never saw or anybody saw a bear fishing. And now to have bears fishing again is pretty exciting, really.
Oh, wow, yeah, that is, like, for that to happen in a human lifetime is quite something, isn't it?
Yeah, yep. I've seen the peak and the bottom, and now hopefully we're working our way back to the peak again.
But here's one surprising thing that nobody was expecting. Yellowstone's grizzly population continued to grow, even during the 20 years when there were virtually no cutthroat for them to catch and eat. It's incredible. They don't just die because the fish have gone.
No, and they have so many food options.
Yeah.
And, you know, even foods that are much lower as far as kilocalories per gram, bears seem to do okay just by eating a lot more of those when they have to. Pretty rare that we see a bear starving to death until they're, you know, really old and their teeth are completely worn out.
Bears are omnivores. They'll eat whatever they can find. So for a while, the mama bears stopped teaching their cubs how to fish the streams and started looking elsewhere for food. One outcome was that they got really good at finding elk calves instead. But that ancient knowledge about fishing lingered.
And bears have great memories, especially for where they successfully got high-quality foods. And so some of these bears we're seeing fishing, we assume are bears that fished a long time ago that, still remember and still check out these spawning streams.
They remember the good old days.
Yes.
This used to be such a good fishing hole.
Yeah.
What seems ironic, and as we've been learning more about this journey, it feels like the cutthroat trout started declining. Grizzly bears, in some cases, were not dependent upon, but utilizing cutthroat quite a lot.
Yep.
Cutthroat dropped. Grizzly bears brought attention to the cutthroat. Grizzly bears then diversified.
Yeah, moved on.
And in their wake, they've helped the trout, ironically.
Yes.
The bears were relying on the fish, but it turns out the fish needed the grizzly bears.
Yes.
Yeah, the PR machine.
Yeah.
The great grizzly. Today, there are about 1,000 grizzly bears in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and there were more grizzly bear cubs born this year than anyone can remember. It's my last evening in Yellowstone. I've not seen any grizzlies this time, but I have found a group of 6 very excited friends who've been fly fishing in a local hotspot I heard about. One of them has a Trout Unlimited license plate, all the way from Georgia.
I did?
Did you get
After you left?
cutthroat that was about that big.
Oh, no.
He pulls out his phone and proudly shows us the pictures.
I just took a picture of him in the net.
Oh, yeah, he's pretty. Isn't that
2 pounds.
gorgeous? Yeah.
Gorgeous. Look at the colours on that.
He's being very well behaved while you're my fish are always like, I can never get him to hold still.
Do you compliment him?
No, well, yes. I say, oh, you're so beautiful. They keep wiggling.
The fishermen gently returned the precious cutthroat to the creek, part of the regulations in place to protect the fish. It reminds me, people don't just come to Yellowstone for the bears. Is this what you've come for all the way across the country?
It's one of the things I've come for.
And specifically cutthroat?
And specifically, yes, these cutthroat and these meadows are super special.
Yep.
And it's gorgeous. So.
As we're leaving, one of the women tells us about a grizzly bear right on the trail they took to go fishing. She points to a Park Service sign. It has today's date on it, and it says, "Warning, bear frequenting area."
Well, there was a bear.
Do you know there was a bear up at First Meadow?
No.
It's a bison kill, and the grizzlies are feeding on it.
But we didn't see any grizzlies.
But we didn't see
Okay,
any. Yeah.
and it's up that trail?
Yeah,
Here,
quite a
Show
ways.
you up the map.
And that's where you were fishing as well?
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Show them some pictures of where we were.
the grizzlies may have been feasting on the bison.
That's where we were.
My bet is that they're on this creek because cutthroat are back on the menu too.
Show you on the map.
For me, this is what Yellowstone does. It's big and wild enough for us to see the coming and going of species. Grizzly bear numbers bouncing back since they were protected in the 70s. And now the return of cutthroat trout too, despite its voracious adversary, the lake trout. It's Yellowstone's stories that have always pulsed through this place. Like a fish swimming across the continental divide, or a bear catching 26 trout in 30 minutes, and biologists controlling one species to save another. Yellowstone shows us what nature is capable of with a little human support. And as these species come back, the ecological twists, turns and surprises teach us new ways to deal with conservation hiccups and obstacles everywhere. The world's first national park, still in all her magnificent glory. And what a show she puts on. A quick heads up to all you listeners who listen to The Wild on Spotify. We have a poll going on. Which national park episode was your favourite so far? Check it out and vote. Thanks so much. As always, there are some great photographs and clips from our journey through the national parks on Instagram at The Wild Pod and at Chris Morgan Wildlife. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, with support from Wildlife Media. This show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special, immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to kuow.org/donate/thewild. Thank you. This episode was produced by Lucy Suchek, writing by Christopher Preston. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Alan Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellowlees, Barbara Stallman, and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes Roy Campanella III, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Gianotti Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Matt Martin, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggin-Schmidt, Brandon Sweeney, and Hans Twite. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. Additional music by Carly Burke, also known as Arsis Marty. I'm Chris Morgan. Take good care and keep in touch. We love hearing from you.